I think we may all be familiar with the story of Moses and his sister hiding him in the reeds in a floating basket his mother had crafted. We probably know it best the way that Cecil B. DeMille told it, of course, with Miriam setting him into the river and Pharaoh's daughter discovering him and him growing up in the palace of Pharaoh. Jochebed, his mother, remains out of the picture until he is an adult. But the story in Exodus remembers that Miriam was recruited by the princess to find a wet nurse for her. And lo and behold, she brings Jochebed to the palace. Thus, in Exodus, Moses not only knows his background, but also is fed on his own mother's milk. Not at all like what you saw in the movie. By this time in our story, we know that there is something remarkably vitalizing about Hebrew women, even in captivity. Read properly and in light of this knowledge, there is never any doubt in the reader's mind that Pharaoh stands no chance against Yahweh and this God's beloved people. The Cuban-American theologian Kat Armas, in her series of reflections entitled Abuelita Faith, abuelita being the affectionate term in Spanish for grandmother, Kat reflects upon the role of two women, Shiphrah and Puah, who developed for the Israelites enslaved in Egypt an identity against all likelihood. Pharaoh demands of these two that they and their guild of Goshen midwives, Goshen being where they are living in Egypt at the time, should kill any Hebrew boy born in their presence. Goshen being where Israel had encamped when Joseph was living, there they could be found when this Pharaoh rose up. But Shiphrah and Puah and all the midwives elected instead to report to Pharaoh that birthing for enslaved women, for these enslaved women, was not like birthing for Egyptian women. Pay attention to how they reply to Pharaoh. They say, and I quote, and by the way, the version you read a little while ago misquotes, "They're animals." That's what the guild leaders declared. They're animals. Their word in Hebrew translates literally as animals, according to Dr. Armas, who also points out that editions of the Bible have softened the language too much. These women use Pharaoh's prejudice against him. He would have presumed that Israel were all inferior, primitive creatures. By the way, how else do you end up in slavery? The idea of their women birthing without effort would have been entirely unbelievable given the fact that he was not only subjugating the men to making the bricks out of clay only, he was not only subjugating the men to the fields, he was doing this with their women as well. They should have, through hard labor, been making it impossible for them to be birthing healthy children. Shiphrah and Puah say that the women are animals because they continue to prosper even under these conditions. And it's given evidence by the fact that when their babies are born, they're born before the midwives can even get there. They lie. Lying in order to indicate to Pharaoh that they are sympathetic with his own understanding, Shiphrah and Puah employ a slur and a mischaracterization of their own people. The author of Exodus indicates that the unlikely abundance of Israel, even in captivity, made the midwives' reporting that much more believable. The Israelite women, as much as their men, enjoyed the favor of their God so much against all odds, they thrived thrived even when oppressed. In America today, it is not so much discussed that women of ethnic, racial, and other vulnerable minorities have lower healthy outcomes with regard to their birthing. Now, by minorities here, I am referring in the political sense to the word minority. As in the case, the prince was in his minority until he came of age when he was granted his majority. Majority, in this case, clearly does not refer to numbers. It refers to power. Majority is power. Minority is lack of power. Obviously, white males do not enjoy the privilege of overwhelming numbers in our society, yet we are the majority in American society. It is our will that tends toward supremacy, and it is when we are fearful that others have reason to be frightened. Don't threaten a white man unless you're another white man. Except in rare cases, such as when you are poor or counted among another minority. Whiteness and maleness aren't likely to help you then. Midwives, though, in the midst of this reality, have become the stuff of legend. I was born in a hospital with my mother mildly sedated and having an epidural. There was no pain associated with my birth, at least not ultimately. My father, on the other hand, because he was born during a magnificent snowstorm, is named Donald Lee Denoon. What does Donald and Lee have to do with a magnificent snowstorm? His birth was attended at his home by two midwives who made it to the house despite all odds. Their names were Donna and Leah. Hear that? But I remember being in awe, wonder, and bearing a bit of concern when I learned that my grandmother had given birth to not just one, but all four of her children on her own bed. What was Grandma going to do if something about one of it's either my father or his siblings, had gone wrong? In American society, at the turning of the last century, medicine became professionalized and dominated by, you guessed it, white men. With the advance of obstetrics and gynecology, midwifery was phased out of common practice almost entirely. This practice of assisting women through the process of childbirth, midwife, comes from the Old English, mid meaning with, wife meaning woman, was displaced by the medical understanding that birth was not so much a natural process, simply requiring the aid and expertise of a practiced professional, as it was a dangerous condition requiring care available only from highly trained medical professionals. Midwife-assisted births went from approximately 50% in the United States in 1900 to 15% by 1935. Mary Breckinridge, and by 1935, midwifery was practiced almost entirely in the U.S. by black women and poor white women. The poor white women, like Donna and Leah, poor black women, like what were called granny midwives. And these were to be found almost exclusively in the South, although they apparently got as far north as Indianapolis, Indiana, where my father was born. Mary Breckinridge, who had been a Red Cross nurse in Europe during World War I, in 1925 founded the Frontier Nursing Service, which included a home birthing service led by nurse midwives. While similar services were provided throughout Europe, as depicted in one of our favorite PBS television series called The Midwife, In the U.S., midwifery was languishing except in the FNS. There were only 70 nurse midwives practicing in the entire United States by the early 1960s. Even though midwifery has rebounded as a practice over the past 60 years, its rebound has only brought it back to the 15% of vaginal births reported in 1935 to have been completed in the United States. Why do I offer you this information? Because it occurs to me, a la our reading of Psalm 22 at the beginning of the worship service this morning, that Shiphrah and Puah introduced to Israel a new understanding of who God is and how God is at work among us. And in Psalm 22, that picture is truly revealed. Hold that thought. I'll get back to it in a minute. Kat Armas, in a recent Christian Century article, cites the Old Testament scholar Jacqueline Lapsley, who observes that the unfruitfulness of Israel's enslaved women would have been, or the fruitfulness of Israel's enslaved women would have been unexpected. Oppression tends to indicate the languishing of a population, not its expansion. And Lapsley writes, in every other case, the conditions of hard labor and poverty would tend to decrease in infant survival rates. But these people, and specifically these women, defy the logic of suffering and death by exploding with children. The midwives perpetuate this fecundity among their Hebrew sisters, and God blesses them with families of their own. I'd ask you to observe a couple of things in light of what Kat Armas and Jacqueline Lapsley and I have said so far about Shiphrah and Puah and the other heroic women of Israel's Egyptian enslavement. First, as in the case of Shiphrah and Puah, referring to their sisters as animals when it comes to giving birth, witness that people in power, such as Pharaoh, like to be told that they are right, and that this weakness of theirs can be exploited for the sake of those who are powerless. So, first lesson, when you cannot speak truth to power, sometimes strategic lying will suffice. Second, observe God's special favor not only for those who are on the lowest societal rung, but especially for those who are willing to practice civil disobedience in order to counteract injustice. Exodus chapter 1 is a cautionary tale for people who believe that they are somehow better than others. And it's a congratulatory tale for those who choose to use their privilege, however apparently insignificant, for the sake of the underprivileged. If you are comfortable, the story assures us, you will be afflicted by your own privilege eventually. And if you are afflicted, we therefore may be assured you will be divinely comforted. God will afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And maybe there's another unexpected matter to be faced here. I mentioned Psalm 22 a little while ago. Among midwives, it is their favorite passage in the Bible. Note how in the midst of a poem which otherwise describes the affliction of a righteous person, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is how it begins. Someone who has all their life sought to live according to God's expectations of us then speaks these words: "It was you who took me from the womb. You kept me safe on my mother's breast. On you I was cast from my birth, and since my mother bore me, you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one else to help. Behold the presence of a midwife. The strong aid and confident wisdom of a woman attending women and welcoming babies are the characteristics of our God, who helps us all the way through to the end of our pain, and who rejoices with us in our happy outcomes. Here among us right now, God is powerful in ways that defy the regimented, scientific, dare I say, masculine imagination. God is a keeper of rhythms. God is a keeper of flows. God is one who recognizes that there are some things best left to unfold towards blessing and out of our control. We need not fear, even though we will fear. And when we do fear, God is there. God is there. God is here. As we birth something new. Thanks be to God. Amen.